May 14th, 2008. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home after a quiet night out. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't high. But at around 1:54 a.m., his car ended up in a ditch on a pitch-black back road in rural Minnesota. So he did what anyone would do. He called his parents, calmly. He said he was fine and just needed a ride. For the next 47 minutes, he stayed on the phone, guiding them to his location while walking along the roadside. They couldn't find him. He couldn't see their lights. They honked. He heard nothing. And then just like that, he shouted, "Oh, shh!" and the call went silent, forever. Brandon was never seen or heard from again. No body, no clues, no answers. Only a phone call, and a trail that led absolutely nowhere. Brandon Swanson had just finished celebrating the end of his spring semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. It wasn't a wild party, just a small get-together with classmates. He left a little before midnight to drive home to Marshall, a quiet town where nothing unusual ever happened, but somehow along the way something did. Around 1:54 a.m., Brandon accidentally drove into a ditch. He wasn't injured. His car wasn't wrecked, just stuck. So he pulled out his phone and called his parents, Brian and Annette, for help. He said he believed he was near the town of Lind, about 7 miles from home. Calm and collected, he told them to come get him and began walking toward lights he thought belonged to the town. What happened next is one of the strangest missing person cases in American history. As his parents drove out to find him, Brandon stayed on the phone giving directions, describing landmarks and saying he could see their headlights, but they couldn't see him. They kept asking, "Are you sure you're near Lind?" He insisted he was. They drove around honking. He never heard them. He described fences, gravel roads, and distant lights. He sounded confident, not panicked. For 47 straight minutes, his father stayed on the line, trying to follow his son's voice in the dark. Brandon kept walking, giving updates the entire time, but their paths never crossed. Then at 2:17 a.m., everything changed. Brandon stopped talking mid-sentence. There was a brief pause. Then loud and clear, he said, "Oh, shh." The call cut off. His parents tried calling back over and over. No answer. They assumed his phone had died or lost signal, but when they couldn't find him anywhere nearby, worry turned to panic. That morning, they reported him missing. The police told them not to worry. He was an adult, probably just sleeping it off somewhere. But Brandon wasn't like that. He didn't drink heavily, didn't do drugs, and wasn't the kind to just disappear. His parents knew something was wrong. By the time investigators got involved, hours had passed, and Brandon was already gone. By sunrise, Brandon's parents had already called the police, but the initial response wasn't what they expected. Because Brandon was 19 and legally an adult, officers suggested he may have just left on his own and would turn up later. But his parents knew something wasn't right. Brandon didn't have a history of disappearing. He was responsible, level-headed, and he never sounded afraid on the phone until that final second. Still, officers waited until later that day to begin an official search. It was then that the first major discovery came in. Brandon's car was found, not near the town of Lindy, where he said he was, but on the outskirts of Taunton, almost 25 miles away. That was the first red flag. Brandon grew up here. He knew these roads. How could he be that far off and not realize it? Investigators searched the vehicle and the area around it. There were no signs of a struggle. The car wasn't damaged. It had simply rolled into a shallow ditch. They called in search dogs, who immediately picked up his scent. The trail followed the gravel road, cut across a ditch, and continued through a wide field toward the Yellow Medicine River. It was a clear and steady path. No signs of panic or running. It looked like he was heading somewhere intentionally. But what happened at the edge of that river changed everything. As the dogs approached the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, Brandon's trail suddenly ended. No signs of him entering the water. No signs of him walking away. It was as if he'd vanished mid-step. They brought in divers to search the river, fearing he may have fallen in and drowned. But the water wasn't deep and it moved slowly. If he had fallen, his body or belongings should have surfaced. Nothing did. The search expanded. Local police, state agencies, and volunteers scoured miles of farmland. Drones flew overhead. ATVs rolled through the cornfields. Helicopters with infrared scanned every heat signature they could find. Horses were brought in to cover ground that machines couldn't reach. But still, nothing. Even stranger, Brandon's phone kept ringing. For nearly 24 hours after the last call, his phone would ring several times before going to voicemail. That meant it was still powered on, still nearby, but no one could find it. And Brandon never picked up. Locals started whispering. Some said they saw strange lights in the fields that night. Others reported hearing faint voices in the early morning hours. Coming from wooded land near an old, rundown property, there were stories passed around quietly about that property. A place kids dared each other to visit. A place people avoided at night. But there was no proof, just rumors. Still, nothing explained how Brandon's trail ended so suddenly, or why a wide-open landscape, searched by dozens of people, could hide someone so completely. The deeper investigators dug, the more confusing Brandon's case became. His calm voice on the phone didn't match the chaos that followed. He never once said he was scared. He wasn't shouting for help. He believed he was close to town and close to safety. That kind of confidence made his sudden disappearance even harder to explain. When they retraced his phone call, they realized something chilling. Based on the timeline, Brandon was on the phone for 47 minutes while walking. That meant he could have covered up to 4 miles on foot. But despite days of searching in every possible direction, not a single item of his, no clothing, no shoes, not even a phone, was ever recovered. Authorities started exploring other explanations. Had Brandon suffered a head injury during the crash that caused confusion or disorientation? Medical experts said that was unlikely. He was coherent and consistent throughout the call. Another theory suggested he may have fallen into an unmarked sinkhole or abandoned well, something deep enough to hide him but narrow enough to leave no visible trace. But in a region like that, those are rare and dangerous enough that locals would have known if one existed nearby. Still, nothing explained why the search dogs led investigators straight to the river and then stopped. By the second week, search teams had expanded their perimeter. Hundreds of volunteers walked grid patterns across fields, but it was like chasing smoke. Every lead either vanished or ended in contradiction. GPS data, phone pings, and dog trails gave them starting points, but no destination. What really unsettled people was how close Brandon had been to help. He was on the phone with his father for nearly an hour. He was convinced he could see lights. That means he wasn't far from a road or a house or a farm, but he never made it to any of them. Not even close. Investigators went door to door, asking landowners to let them search. Almost everyone cooperated. Almost. A few isolated properties refused access, people who didn't want police on their land, for reasons they never explained. In a tight-knit rural town, that kind of refusal raised eyebrows. Some residents still wonder if one of those places might be hiding something. Brandon's friends described him as logical, grounded, the kind of guy who wouldn't take unnecessary risks. That made the silence even harder to accept. He didn't just vanish, he was erased. The field held no secrets. The river told no story. His voice faded into the night. And that was it. No goodbyes, no trace. Just one final sentence that's still echoing all these years later. As months passed with no new clues, the case began to drift out of the headlines. But for Brandon's parents, the nightmare never stopped. They couldn't sleep without replaying every word from that final call. His tone, his footsteps, the strange calm before the last moment, and then that single frightened shout, "Oh, shh!" before total silence. Something happened in that second, something sudden, and whatever it was left no trace. Some investigators held on to the theory that Brandon may have slipped into the river, even though no remains were ever found. Others wondered if he got turned around and succumbed to exposure. But again, no physical evidence supported either idea, so the speculation deepened. One theory suggested he may have stumbled onto private land and encountered someone who didn't want him there. In rural areas, it's not uncommon for landowners to protect their property, aggressively, especially at night. Could someone have confronted him? Could panic or paranoia have led to a fatal mistake? There was no proof of this, but the people who refused access to their land only fed the whispers. Another possibility struck a nerve with locals. Some speculated Brandon may have been picked up by someone driving along a nearby road. Maybe he asked for help, or maybe he never had the chance. But again, no vehicles were reported. No neighbors recalled seeing a stranger on the roads that night. Just silence. Still, stories kept spreading. One group of searchers claimed their dogs reacted strangely near an old, decaying shed deep in the woods, off the main grid, on land that hadn't been used in years. But by the time police got permission to enter, the shed was empty. Nothing left. Just old boards, broken tools, and a cold floor that told no story. Brandon's phone records offered little more. The last ping showed it connected to a tower near Porter, Minnesota, almost 20 miles from where he said he was. The locations never lined up. It was as if Brandon had been walking one path, but his signal was traveling another. To this day, law enforcement won't say what they believe happened. The case remains open, active, and deeply frustrating. But for people in Marshall and Taunton, the story became something more. It became a local legend, not just a disappearance, but a mystery that seemed to swallow a person whole, leaving behind only a voice in the dark. And that voice, once calm, once steady, ended with one line that still haunts everyone who hears it. 15 years later, Brandon Swanson is still missing. No physical evidence has ever surfaced. Not a shoe, not a wallet, not even a broken phone. It's as if the earth opened up, took him, and sealed itself behind him. But the emotional evidence? That never went away. His parents have become advocates for missing persons cases, pushing for change in how law enforcement responds when adults disappear. They helped pass Brandon's law in Minnesota, requiring police to immediately begin searching when a vulnerable adult goes missing, no matter their age. It was a win, but it didn't bring Brandon back. Some nights, people in Taunton still drive down those same gravel roads. Some stop where Brandon's car was found. Others walk along the fence line where the dogs lost his scent. And there's always that same question. How does someone vanish in the middle of open farmland? While talking on the phone the entire time? There's a theory few people say out loud, but it lingers. What if Brandon wasn't alone out there? Some locals believe Brandon walked straight into something he wasn't supposed to see. Someone living off-grid. Someone hiding. Someone willing to do anything to stay invisible. A person with no phone, no neighbors, and no hesitation. And maybe that person made sure Brandon never left. Others suggest it was something more ordinary, but just as devastating. A freak accident like a hidden ravine, a sudden collapse of soft ground, or an animal encounter that ended quickly and cleanly. But that doesn't explain why his phone stayed on, why it kept ringing, why his scent stopped at the river and never picked up again. The most chilling part of the story isn't what's known, it's what isn't. The clues don't match the location. The trail doesn't fit the timeline. And even the most detailed searches by professionals, volunteers, dogs, drones, and helicopters turned up absolutely nothing. What really happened out there remains buried in silence, a mystery sealed by distance, time, and darkness. But that final sentence Brandon spoke before the line went dead? That wasn't silence. It was fear. And it's the only sound this case ever gave us. Brandon Swanson's story is more than a mystery. It's a reminder of how quickly normal can turn into unknown. One minute he was calling his parents for help, calm, aware, fully in control. The next he was gone, not just missing, but completely erased. What haunts people the most isn't just the silence after that final call. It's the fact that he seemed so close to being saved. His parents were out there searching. He could see lights. He was giving directions. They were right there, and still, they never crossed paths. How does that happen in today's world, with GPS, satellites, towers, surveillance, thermal drones? How does a young man simply vanish off the face of the earth? That question still echoes louder than any search effort. His disappearance didn't just break hearts, it broke logic. And in doing so, it became one of the most frustrating and unsolved missing person cases in modern America. But Brandon left something behind. A law that helps other families get faster help. A case that forced departments to change their response times. And a voice, his voice, forever frozen in time, still ringing in the ears of anyone who hears his final words. If someone out there knows something, they haven't come forward. If there was a mistake, no one's found it. If it was just bad luck, then it's a kind of bad luck we still don't understand. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Not that Brandon vanished, but that anyone could.